All right. Thank you very much, folks, for joining us here on this Friday afternoon. This is a very exciting opportunity, I think. The History Department and the President's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council, very happy to introduce Dr. Michael Perri, Professor of History here at A&M-Texarkana and noted expert on colonial Latin America, to give us a talk sort of in honor and support of Hispanic Heritage Month on the 16th century demographic collapse in Mexico. So I'm going to turn it over to Michael, and yeah, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Craig. I'm a little shocked that we have so many people here on a Friday afternoon to listen to this, but I'm glad. I find this very interesting. I will admit right now that even though my specialty is colonial Latin America and even the conquest, this isn't my specialty, but I do teach it and I find it very interesting, and I have delved somewhat superficially into the historiography and research of it. So let's, on that note, let's just get started. So I do have some stuff. This is coming from a global history source, as you can see, and it's just an estimate of the Native American population in Mexico and its decline in the 16th century. I won't worry about the population in the millions yet. That is controversial. This would be actually considered a rather high estimate of the population. We'll talk about that in a bit. But this general downward line is pretty much agreed to. There's a consensus among historians that there was a demographic collapse. In fact, the most tragic and largest demographic collapse in history. History meaning that historians know of, that may have been earlier in the human species, bigger demographic collapses. But we have, as far as we know in history, this is the largest demographic collapse in history. And so let's move on. One reason to understand why it was so bad is for two things. One, it was a virgin soil epidemic. And the virgin soil epidemic actually was a term coined by the historian Alfred Crosby, who published the seminal Columbian Exchange, which was published in 1972. And it's just a legendary work, and actually where we get the term Columbian Exchange, for example. But he defined virgin soil epidemics as epidemics in which the populations at risk have no previous contact with disease that strike them and are therefore immunologically almost defenseless. So the natives of the Americas did not have the immunological defense systems that their African, European, and actually Asian, if they ever came across an Asian, they will in the 17th century, had. Why? Well, because Europeans, Africans, and Asians by the 16th century were a thoroughly diseased people, set of people, you might say. Why? Were there a variety of reasons for this? Wars and trade had enabled the peoples of Africa and Asia and Europe to exchange different pathogens for thousands of years and going into the past. And the other reason is that they were often sharing many pathogens with domesticated animals. If you read accounts of the Middle Ages, you find that the cities, they have all kinds of ordinances where the animals could be, but you still had problems of animals living in very close vicinity with people in many of these villages. And we had animals, defecating and everything very close by. And so you had an intimate living condition with a lot of domesticated animals and the exchange of pathogens. So for a variety of reasons, you have many more pathogens and a variety of pathogens exposed to the populations of Europe, Africa, and Asians. And these people at times were devastated. I mean, there were times when a new pathogen would strike their population and they would suffer from it. And obviously like the Black Plague, for example. But these virgin soil epidemics were usually like one virgin soil at a time and for a generation. And so they were less catastrophic than they would be for the Amerindian Indians in the New World. So the real reason it was so bad for those in the indigenous to the Americas was that they did not share the same immunological defenses as the European counterparts, namely the Spaniards who were coming over and bringing these pathogens to them. And if the Spaniards had only brought one pathogen, they probably would have still had a large percentage of their population decline, but not to the same catastrophic degree that it did. The reason why you have a mortality of some 90%, and the big debate is whether it's 90 or 98% of the New World peoples, is because there was a series of virgin soil epidemics. In other words, the population would, like any other population, would normally recover from an epidemic, but then as soon as they recovered, they'd be hit by another one, and then as soon as they recovered, they hit by still a new one, and then as soon as they recovered, they were hit yet by a third and fourth and fifth one. So here's some of the big ones. Mexico was hit, it says here, by a series of virgin soil epidemics involving different pathogens, whereas in the old world, a single pathogen virgin soil epidemic was responsible for the Black Plague, for example, one of the biggest epidemics we know of in Europe. The catastrophic decline in Mexico's indigenous population was primarily due to the combined effect of a series of epidemic crises, each of which reduced the population significantly. Okay. Now we're talking about things like the mortality rate, and when we talk about the crude death rate, that is the mortality rate from all the causes of death for a population. So obviously during an epidemic, most of the deaths usually will be from the epidemic or the pathogen, but there's also related ones, such as famine or just other natural causes of death. And virgin soil epidemics cause very large increases in the crude death rates and similar decreases in the crude birth rates. And as this will point out, usually such increases and decreases are relatively brief, but in this case of the 16th century, because there's series after series after series, there's a kind of elongated crisis, demographic crisis, that results in the population decline. Here is a graph taken from the scholar Dr. Thomas Whitmore, a geographer, and he looks at here all these epidemics. You can see down here. Here, let me get my pointer up. You can see down here these epidemics here, and the resulting crude death rate. He also is going to, Whitmore is also going to look at famines, and there is a correlation between famines and epidemics as well. This slide just basically is going to outline only the most severe of the epidemics. Probably the most severe one happened during the actual conquest in 1520 and 1521, and that was smallpox. And smallpox had been endemic among Europeans previous to this, and many Europeans had suffered through it but not died from it. And when it hit the population that had no immunological defenses to fight against smallpox in the New World, that population was severely devastated. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second, but moving on to the second one, this epidemic was followed by measles. Again, measles was endemic with the among the Europeans. You could, if you actually studied European historical demography and epidemics or diseases, you would find that there was always a frightful toll of children who died from measles every year. That said, most of them survived. It was kind of a rite of passage of childhood. You had to have measles and chicken pox and those kind of diseases, and you would suffer and your parents would be worried, and hopefully you wouldn't die. That's the reason you wanted to have a high fertility rate and have more kids, because some would die. But just about every adult Spaniard who came to the New World had measles as a child and had survived it, and now a new epidemic of measles breaks out among the indigenous of the Americas in Mexico, in particular in 1530 and 31, and it was devastating. People died from it very quickly. Also, the healthiest in the population who had not been exposed to it. These are not just children. Some of the healthiest adults in the population died from measles. Then already by 1545 to 1548, we have probably the second most devastating of the deadly epidemics that hit Mexico population during the 16th century. And we don't really know what it really was until recently. We thought it was typhus, the pneumonic plague, or something. But recent research, DNA research combined with archaeology, now think it was salmonella. So I'll talk a little bit about that later. In 1776 to 81, we'll have another devastating epidemic in typhus. When we say it's typhus, we're historians are guessing. They read the description of the symptoms, and based on that, they're taking their best guess at what was the disease. And that goes the same for the last round of epidemics for the big ones, at least for the 16th century. In 1590, we have influenza being a very severe form of influenza that's going to devastate much of the population of central Mexico. Here over to your left is a graph from Whitmore, who has a variety of notes here about which diseases struck when. And you can see here, like in 1558, we also have it sometimes coupled with death and famine. And he has his sources, which is always good. A lot of times we don't know what exactly it is. Cocolitzi, for example, that you see here, and over here you're going to see this from Noble David Cook, Cocolitzi, or Hue Cocolitzi. Cocolitzi just means sickness, and Hue is just the word, vary. So Hue Cocolitzi would be big sickness or great sickness. And so, we're left like, okay, what in the world is that, right? And so we just have to look at the symptoms, and sometimes that is easy to do, and sometimes it is a guess, just a guess. Let's talk about smallpox right now. And smallpox, the first big outbreak of smallpox, which was devastating. Many historians think that this was the most devastating outbreak, even though the one in 1545 to 48 was also pretty bad. And it happened while the Spaniards were it happened while the Spaniards were expelled from the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan, right? So you have the La Noche Triste. I don't know how many of you know anything about the history of the conquest, but the Spaniards had held the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma in captivity, and were trying to rule with him as a veneer or him as a puppet kind of emperor for a while. The Aztecs are going to get very upset about this at one point and expel the Spaniards and kill a great number of the Spaniards and their Tlaxcalan allies, and the Spaniards then limp back to Tlaxcala. But when they do this, there was a new expedition that came to actually arrest Cortez and actually ended up joining him. But this expedition had come recently from the Antilles. It was formed in Cuba, but it also had a lot of people coming from San Juan de Puerto Rico and Dominican and the Highland of Hispaniola and Santo Domingo. So historians talk about an African slave coming with this Navarrete expedition and entering Tenochtitlan and spreading it there right before the Spaniards were expelled from the capital. Other historians have pointed out that there were also many indigenous servants that had joined the expedition from the Antilles, the Greater Antilles in the Caribbean, and so they also might have carried the sickness. But whatever the case, when the Spaniards were defeated and left, and just when the people of Tenochtitlan were enjoying their great victory over the Spaniards, a devastating epidemic of smallpox broke out. And according to an Indian count, we were so covered with agonizing sores from head to foot. Illness was so dreadful that no one could walk or move. One of the Spaniards with Cortez, Bernardino Vasquez de Tapia, stated that more than a quarter of the population of Tenochtitlan died of smallpox during the siege. And David Noble Cook actually, David Noble Cook has a book, if you're very interested in this is the book I would probably most recommend. It's called Born to Die, a great morbid title, Born to Die, Disease and New World Conquest. And he actually claims with him looking at native accounts, most of the native accounts actually, the source of those being the Florentine Codice, which was written under the direction of Spanish friars after the conquest. So we always got to know where we get our information from. But looking at native sources, he concludes that native accounts of the Spanish conquest of Mexico stress the fact that the terrible epidemic was more memorable than the military conquest and death by the sword. And we have also other contemporary accounts, Spanish accounts in this case. So Dominican Francisco de Aguilar, who had been with Cortez during the conquest, wrote, "God saw fit to send the Indian smallpox, and there was a great pestilence in the city." And according to Cortez's 16th century biographer, Lopez de Gomara, the enemy lost 100,000 men or many more, and I'm not including those who died of hunger and pestilence. They, the defenders, slept among the dead and lived in perpetual stench, for which reasons they sickened or were struck down by pestilence, in which an infinite number died. There is very little doubt that even though the Aztecs were initially successful in militarily defeating the Spaniards, the war had not ended yet. The Spanish were regrouping in Tlaxcala, and the Mexica people, or the Aztecs in Tenochtitlan, were just devastated by the smallpox epidemic, which took not just the young and the old or the weak, but actually took oftentimes the strongest in their society, the healthiest, strongest adults in their society. For example, Moctezuma died, I won't go into his death, but his heir, Cuauhtémoc, was among the first victims of the smallpox epidemic. That probably killed many more Mexica than did violent battles with Cortez. And following Cuauhtémoc's death, we have authority passing on to the 18-year-old Cuauhtémoc. So now you can imagine the crisis of leadership in which now an 18-year-old comes to the throne as the new emperor, because so many of the generals and so many of the leadership and the heirs to take the throne either were devastated or sick or died. This is again from the Florentine Codice, the actual book you can read it in that's published. It's called Broken Spears, the Aztec Account of the Conquest of Mexico. It's somewhat the translations of the Florentine Codice, which were written in the wall, are somewhat controversial, but I'm not going to go into that at the moment. I'll just say that I'll just read some of this, that while the Spaniards were in Tlaxcala, a great plague broke out here in Tenochtitlan that lasted for 70 days, striking everywhere in the city and killing a vast number of our people. Sores erupted on our faces, our breasts, our bellies. We were covered with agonizing sores from head to foot. The illness was so dreadful that no one could walk or move. The sick were so utterly helpless that they could lie on their beds like corpses, unable to move their limbs or even their heads. They could not lie face down or roll from side to side. If they did move their bodies, they screamed with pain. A great many died from this plague, and many others died of hunger. They could not get up to search for food, and everyone else was too sick to care for them. So they starved to death in their beds. Some people came down with a milder form of disease. They suffered less than the others and made a good recovery, but they could not escape entirely. Their looks were ravaged, for wherever a sore broke out, it gouged an ugly pockmark in their skin, and a few of the survivors were left completely blind from pockmark on their eyes. All right, so that was the smallpox epidemic and the conquest, and I think it's pretty incontrovertible that it's not very much of a controversy that the smallpox epidemic very much helped the Spaniards conquer the Aztec Empire, and especially the capital city, Tenochtitlan. And who knows what the outcome might have been without this outbreak of smallpox. You can imagine a society fighting a war of survival at the same time when they are having trouble surviving because of a disease like smallpox. We really didn't know the source of the one of the great epidemics, the one in 1545 to 1550. But there has been some recent DNA evidence, DNA extracted from the teeth of some victims, indicate that salmonella was a source for maybe this horrible epidemic in 45 to 50. By the way, I don't know if I have it in one of my slides, but one of the accounts is that this epidemic was so bad that the way to bury the people would just collapse their houses on them, and we actually then have archaeological evidence of houses collapsed on bodies, which was pretty amazing. Sometimes the documents actually are corroborated by archaeological evidence. So how devastating were these diseases and epidemics over the course of the 16th century? Well, that is a point of interminable controversy. I don't think the controversy so much is about how devastating they were. It was like 90%, but how quick and how many people died. Here you can see this is the base of the estimates of Sherburne Cook and Leslie Simpson. And you can see, we have figures. The reason this is controversial is they started a very high figure, almost 21 million people. And so you have, 8 million people dying of smallpox, 12 to 15 million people dying of that devastating disease, maybe salmonella in 45. And Cocolizzi, we don't really know in 76, but we think it was typhus. Here is another one by Shelburne Cook and Woodward Bora. And these are going to start also at a very high population, 25 million people, which is probably a little high. But they have a low point in 1608 to have only 852,000 survive this. So this is, by their estimates, devastating. The reason that this is so hard to actually, though, with certainty say anything about is because we really don't know how many people were to start with. right? Estimates of all of central Mexico go from anywhere from 25 million to 8 million. And this actually is a graph of all the different historical estimates of the population just for the basin of Mexico. In other words, Jeff, I don't know if you know anything about Mexico City, but it's a basin surrounded by mountains. It's a pretty mountainous city, but it's a basin in the middle of mountains, a mountain valley, a huge mountain valley, more like a basin. But here you can see all these are pretty respected historians, and you can see that they start with different populations. And if you start a different population, then it's hard to know how many people actually died. Again, this is just for the basin. And what Thomas Whitmore is going to do is he's going to talk about a severe group, right, where these historians think that the population in decline was more severe. Then you have the moderate group, and then you have the mild group. And trying to estimate these now, Whitmore, his methodology is rather interesting. He has so many variables that it's actually, this is one of the things that I should just admit I don't understand completely, but he takes the variables like how virulent each epidemic is, and he will take the moderate kind of versions, and he also will include things like famine that often followed. And so he's going to now come up with his simulation of what happened. And according to Whitmore, the greatest demographic collapse happened right at the beginning, right, with the smallpox epidemic of 1520, 1521. And then it's followed there by the ones in the 40s, 48 to 50, pretty severe. And then we have it going severe, severe, severe. But even though at the end of the century and the beginning of the 17th century, you have more epidemics, it looks like the immunological defense systems are catching up. And so you have each one being less and less severe in terms of crude mortality rate, for example. All right. Here, let me check. Were there questions so far? I'm not quite done. So we're looking at my chat.
I figured we'd probably just do questions at the end, but if folks do have questions,
let's just do questions at the end.
It's fine.
All right. So that's kind of the end of the demographic collapse. But what I want to kind of go into now is, there we go, is the aftermath of this and some of the interesting things that come out of this. One is compadrazgo, right? Compadrazgo is kind of a weird, making co-parenthood or co-godparenthood into now a noun, co-godparenthoodness. Doesn't look, translation is pretty messy. But, okay, so we know what a godparent is, right? And a godparent in Spanish is padrino. What we don't have in English is, what is the relationship between the parent and the godparent? And the relationship between the parent and the godparent is a special relationship in most of Latin American culture, most Hispanic culture, and they're compadres. And compadres are so important, especially in Mexican culture. Picking your compadres when you have children is seen as one of the most important decisions you're going to make as a parent. And then these godparents not only help you with the baptism and the education of the children and first communion and all this other stuff, but they're supposed to help the children throughout their lives as long as both live. And but the relationship between the parents and the godparents is also one of family. What you do when you pick a godparent is you are bringing them into your family, right? You're saying, you are now like my brother. I expect you are now part of my family. You are a co-parent of my children. And this is huge in Latin America. It's not so big in other European Catholic countries of Italy, France, or even so much Spain. It's not as big as it is in Latin America. So why? Why is Comparazzago so big in a place like Mexico? And because it was basically, this is a time before we have wills. This is a time before we have all these legal devices to see where the parents would, children would go if they were orphaned. And so in a time of high insecurity, because you won't know if you're going to live with one of these pandemics, what's going to happen with your children, you wanted to have other parents, other people to take care of your children. There's also other reasons that there is, there are other ways of trying to guarantee that somebody will take care of your society. It's interesting that in terms of tribute, the Spaniards are the Aztecs, first let's go to the Aztecs. The Aztecs asked for tribute, and the Spaniards were able to get many allies because the allies didn't like paying Aztec tribute. The Spaniards, though, are going to just then take the place of the tribute collectors, and all indios, right? All the indigenous people had to pay tribute. But all you had to do to not pay tribute is say, I'm not a part of this Indian community. You could be what they would call a Ladino in Mesoamerica, or a Yanacona in the Andes, and you could just leave your Indian community, declare yourself not part of that community, declare yourself part of the Spanish community, and then you have to pay tribute. But people didn't always do that. Most always stayed part of their Indian community. And the reason they did that is because that was not only their identity, which was very important, but it was also their social network that kind of was their security blanket as well, right? It was if they died, their community would help look after their children. If they looked after each other, yes, they had to pay tribute. Yes, they had often a labor draft system they had to fulfill, but they stayed within their community. There's a lot of things that happened with the demographic collapse, and one of the big ones was a rise in wage labor that happens in the Americas even before it happens in Europe, at least to the extent that it happened in the Americas. And what I'm talking about is let's start from after the conquest. After the conquest, there are very few Spaniards, and there are literally millions and millions of indigenous people. And taxing this labor and asking for a draft labor service system, which they will call the repartimiento in Mexico, mita in the Andes, it just overlays the Aztec system in many ways. And this was just expected as part of service, right? Part of the service to your lord, but they didn't call him lord, they called him an encomendero. Your Spanish person who's supposed to civilize and Christianize you and look after you, and you owe him as a vassal, you owe him labor. So this works for a while, but with the demographic collapse, there's not very many people to work in the draft labor system, and it basically collapses. And Spaniards end up competing for labor, and they end up having to pay people wages. So the labor is going to have a upper hand for a while. Workers are going to have leverage to demand wages. And this is especially in several places, especially in those silver mines of northern Mexico, which is starving for labor at a time when the labor is disappearing, and they're going to actually pay their workers quite well. And not only will they pay them in wages, but they'll also pay them after they mine a certain quantity of ore. They will then be able to mine a certain amount of ore for themselves. So these people could that work these wages could become relatively well off. Also, the landed estates. Here on the left hand, you have this picture of a kind of a plowed piece of land, which was a very different way of agriculture from pre-Columbian agriculture, which was based on mounds and chinampas. And so and then the Spaniards wanted to grow things like wheat on this, but or to look after their cattle or their big estates, and they couldn't have enough workers to do it, so they ended up having to pay workers because the leverage that workers had with the decline in the overall population was much greater. There's also several other things I would like to say about this is that most of the pre-Columbian population, can you see my map and my little laser down here, rested here in southern Mexico and central Mexico. And northern Mexico was very sparsely populated, mostly with Chichimeca types, or we might call them hunter-gatherer nomadic types. And so when the Spaniards discover silver mines up here, they draw labor from all of the heavily densely, usually more densely populated areas and sedimentary, and sedentary kind of agricultural areas of central Mexico. And because we have a mix of people up here in the Spanish mining frontier, these people will actually be more Hispanicized. So if you want to look at Mexico and study Mexico today, the more Hispanicized part of Mexico, and still also the most prosperous area of Mexico, is northern Mexico. You have a mix in central Mexico, and if you go down to Chiapas down here, for example, in southern Mexico, it's going to be much more indigenous. Yes, much more indigenous. Is that it? All right, so there's several things I want to talk about before I open this up to questions. And maybe I should expand that map as well of the, well, let's just put it this way. If we have a 90% mortality, whether we're starting with 8 million originally inhabitants or 25 million original inhabitants, this actually is going to make Mexico Hispanic. And today we're celebrating Hispanic culture, and that's fine. I love Hispanic culture. I don't want to say anything derogatory about it, but I will say that as a one who's also very fascinated with pre-Columbian indigenous culture, that the Hispanic culture we have today in Mexico is a syncretism of both pre-Columbian cultures and Hispanic culture. And one of the things I love to teach in my colonial Latin America class is in terms of religion, in terms of culture, and in terms of language, this syncretism, which is just fascinating to us, to me, and I try to share that with my students. And we're talking about the aftermath of this of this demographic collapse. And I tell my students, without this demographic collapse, we would be struggling to learn Spanish to learn about our southern neighbors. We would be trying to learn Nahuatl or Tarascan or Zapotec. We would be trying to learn some of the indigenous languages, Quiche. We'd be, we wouldn't be learning Spanish. And I also even argue that the Spaniards probably would not have had 300 years of colonial history, which is a very long time, without this demographic collapse. And the analogy I use is this. Let's say the United States was able to conquer China next week. So we conquered China. How fast would we be able to get the Chinese to speak English? How fast would we be able to get them to come over to our version of Christianity and Christian religion, period? I would argue we probably couldn't, and if we did, it would take a very long time. But what if in the process, 92 to 98% of the Chinese population died, which made your religion seemingly more and you didn't die, which means your religion seemed more powerful and thus attractive. And to engage in and make a living and not starve to death, you felt like you had to engage more and more in the conqueror's economy. You would there is a scenario where these Chinese might learn English and might learn adapting our cultures and our religion even, but not completely, never completely. So that is, I bring up that kind of fantastic analogy, imaginary analogy, because that's, I think I'm trying to explain what happened in Mexico. The reason why we're talking about Hispanic culture, and we have Hispanic culture in Mexico to this day, is because it was a dominant culture that was the culture of conquest over a people who were trying to adapt at a time when maintaining their culture and language and way of life was increasingly difficult, with so many of them dying. And the other thing, you know, some actually died out completely. You have the Totonac, which were the people that Hernan Cortez first came to meet on the coast of, east coast of what is today Mexico. And since they were inhabited these lowlands in what is current day state of Veracruz, many of the peoples that lived in the lowlands died out completely. Those who were in higher elevations, especially in some ecological niches in higher elevations, tended to survive because many of the passages were less virulent there. And so we have Hispanic culture because of this crisis, which is in some ways sad, in some ways a reality, in some ways, you know, it's a beautiful syncretism. And I say that because many Mexicans choose what parts of Hispanic culture they'll take, like mis compadres algo, right? Or their many local Virgin Marys and saints in indigenous communities, right? Cabeceras, which were kind of capital regional native communities. And they will choose what part of Hispanic culture they will make their own, including the very Virgin of Guadalupe, right? Who was a virgin Juan Diego saw on the sacred hill of Tepeyac, where the pre-Columbia's goddess Tonantzin once dwelt, right? So there's all these things that are important to understand how Mexican and how Hispanic culture will develop in Mexico, that you almost start with the demographic collapse. I also talked about wage labor. When we get to the 18th century, we are going to talk about debt peonage, right? And because what's going to happen is the population recovers in the 18th century, people are still going to be paid wages, just not wages, enough wages that they can feel like they can escape. In fact, they actually go into debt many times to hacendados, or people who own haciendas, and then we become tied to the land because of debt, much like our sharecropping in this country. But again, it starts with where did wages and how do you get tied to land from debt to and lack of high wages? Well, where did wages come from? Again, that goes back to the demographic collapse. All right, questions?
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Perri. Yeah, if folks have any questions, you can unmute and ask them, or if you want to put them in the chat, I can read them dramatically for you. That's fine.
I just had a couple of comments. one thing that we might point out that the analogous thing to population collapse there occurred with the Native Americans and other places probably like Hawaii and whatnot, where the Europeans came in and probably at a minimum 90% of the Native Americans were wiped out. And as Michael points out, some tribes were now extinct. We have there. And a pretty good book on this, I don't know if Michael would sneer at this or not, but Jared Diamond's Germs, Guns, and Steel, if you're interested in reading about that kind of thing.
Yes, I am aware of Jared Diamond, an anthropological professor at University of California, Los Angeles. And I like his work because he does expand it. Papua New Guinea is where he does most of his actual case studies. But he also broadened this to Africa and so forth. My only problem is, like the National Geographic special they did on him and everything, I think they lionize him too much. And the person I would give most credit to the originality of this idea would be Alfred Crosby in the Columbian Exchange, published in 1972. And although Alfred Crosby was focused on the Columbian Exchange, the exchange that happened after Columbus discovered the New World. Crosby also talks about blood types and the kind of exposure to new pathogens from people who didn't have immunological defense systems around the world as well. And what Jeremy Diamond does is just take that and go a little bit more in depth and maybe into the analysis of other places in the world. He also talks about one of the other contributions that Diamond has is that he talks about how culture and ideas might have spread more in Eurasia and Europe and Asia because the landmass is more horizontal, more ways of sharing from east to west, where the Americas is more kind of spread out geographically north to south, and there's less in common and less sharing of new ideas. So he has all these other interesting contributions, Diamond does. But the real person who first started thinking about this would be Alfred Crosby.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Cantrell, I think you have a question.
Thank you, Craig. Michael, I really appreciated this fantastic talk because first and foremost, it reminds me again how exciting I think it would be to put forth a learning community proposal between the history and the English programs. Because Americanists in literature really tend to use the literature of discovery as a precursor to the literatures of the United States. And so I spend a lot of time in the first few weeks of my Survey of American Literature course underscoring for students that European voyages of exploration and contact covered all of the Americas, really stressing that plurality of the Americas. So my students read eyewitness firsthand accounts of North, Central, South, the Caribbean, the West Indies, by 16th century authors like Bartolomé de las Casas, Hernán Cortés, and Álvaro Cabeza de Vaca. And I think your talk really establishes how and when indigenous peoples in Mexico began to decline in large numbers, if not from war or epidemic disease, then what you've identified here as demographic collapse. And so my question is about labor and colonization. We know that Spanish explorers introduced African slavery to the Americas as early as 1501. And by the middle of the 16th century, indigenous populations had almost been completely displaced by African slaves in some Spanish colonies. So I was wondering if you could speak to how the destruction of one people via epidemic and demographic collapse was so often accompanied by the displacement and enslavement of another.
Well, you mentioned Bartolomé de las Casas, the great defender of the Indians.
Yes.
And he brought this idea that there's some aspects that we're all human. But one of the things that I would say that is a little bit critical of him is he was so protective of the Indians. He thought that it would be better to import African slaves.
Exactly. Yeah.
And there was this mythology to develop that I was just reading yesterday in my American Social Intellectual class by a antebellum minister in his fast day sermons named Palmer, defending the Southern institution of slavery. And he was talking about a tropical environment needs a tropical labor force because they will endure in the heat, and that's African Americans. So where does this come from? African slaves. Where does this come from? Well, it comes from the fact that the Spaniards would be happy to enslave or put in some type of labor system, tributary labor system, the indigenous, but they died off. And especially in places that are lowland places where they might want to grow sugar, for example, they would die off, and they died off, and sometimes they escaped because they knew the land, but they would often die off. And when they brought in Africans, they die off at a slower rate. So obviously Africans are more accustomed, they're sturdier, and they're more accustomed to these kind of tropical climates. What they didn't test is if white people or white European stock people would be just as hardy. They didn't test that. But what happened was that, as much as you might say how different Europeans were from Africans, they actually shared the same immunological defense systems, right? And so Africans would not die off from these diseases, just like whites would not die off from these diseases as in the same kind of degree that the indigenous did. And so you have this now bias that Africans are appropriate for hard labor in the tropics, where the indigenous, which is crazy, the indigenous were living there before the Europeans got there, but the indigenous were not, right? And even though they were already there in 1501, I wonder if they were not there earlier. There's actually some controversy whether they were Africans in Columbus's second voyage, but whatever the case, they were few in number. They will grow in number in the late 16th century and beginning of 17th century for the very reasons that we have. We're talking about this labor shortage, right? They're there in Mexico. You find African slaves primarily working in three different areas. They were working in sugar plantations in the fields of what is current day states of Veracruz and Tabasco. They were, and there was also a huge fugitive slave community in those areas as well. They were working in the mines of northern Mexico, and they also worked as domestic servants for the elite in Mexico City, because having a slave work for you was a sign of status. And they also, much to the annoyance of the Spaniards, often miscegenated with the indigenous. And so you have also the rise of the Castas, this kind of mixed racial population that is Mexico today.
Yeah, I think for my students, especially in those first early weeks, I'm really trying to establish for them the extent to which their maybe elementary school relationship with Spanish explorers like Christopher Columbus needs to be perhaps like demythologized. And so that's why I work in those perspectives from Bartolomé de las Casas, even though he's so problematic in his treatment of African enslavement, in order to protect the indigenous peoples of the West Indies. And so I think that sort of process, that colonization project of the destruction of one people coming at the expense of the displacement and enslavement of another, is something that I want my students in my American literature classes to understand has roots in the very fabric and beginning of the earliest firsthand eyewitness accounts of the Americas, not just, with Thomas Jefferson and notes on the state of Virginia and his pseudoscience around, racial demographics, you know, or even present contemporary moments around these discussions of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, who has access to that still, who has a right to life in our country. And so for students, I think those first few weeks, they're so invested by this like schoolhouse rock narrative of Christopher Columbus, you know, and it takes a lot of work to shift that European, that white settlers, colonizer point of view.
Well, yes, I agree that Columbus is over lionized, should not be lionized to this degree. But I also teach Bartolomé Casas. You know, he has that short Destruction of the Indies, and he has a longer, 3,000-page history of the Indies. I always teach it with some caution, and the reason why is because he is probably the genesis of the Black legend, which is, the idea is that the Spaniards were so cruel, and I'm sure they were cruel. I'm not saying that they weren't, but they were so cruel. That is why we have this demographic collapse, is because they were cruel in the Antilles. They were cruel in all the Americas, actually. And what he does is he documents all this cruelty, and then he documents the losses in population, and the correlation seems incontrovertible. It seems like, oh my goodness, the population is declining because of Spanish brutality. And then, of course, later when the Dutch and the English are fighting against the Spaniards in the later part of the 16th century, and there's this long war, hot and cold, between Spain and England and also the Netherlands. They're going to use the Black legend to say, hey, see how inhumane these Spaniards are, these Catholic types. They're, there you are. There's any more evidence that they're the Antichrist. There it is. But if we look at many Spanish accounts, they're absolutely horrified at the loss of these native populations. They're horrified for a variety of reasons. They're horrified just because they can see it's human suffering. Mm-hmm. They're also very much worried that that many of the conquistadors came to be somebody. And if they got an encomienda, which was a group of Indians who they were supposed to supposedly Christianize and civilize, and therefore get tribute in the form of labor and maybe other ways as well. If they interpreted being an encomendero as like being a noble. And the last thing a noble wants to do is see his serfs die out. Mm-hmm. Right? And the crown was also horrified. The reason why Bartolomé das Casas had so much influence at court, because they saw their subjects dying out in the Americas, their tax-paying subjects dying out in the Americas. And so we have this whole counter movement already starting in the 40s and 50s, and of course really big in the 60s between Louis Hankey and Benjamin Keene. This whole back and forth is how true is Bartolomé das Casas and the Black legend, and how untrue it is. And I think the current consensus is, yes, Spaniards could be very abusive and very, very cruel, but the last thing they wanted to see was the dying off of their workforce, the dying off of the people they were supposed to lord over.
Yeah, and if worse came to worse with that economic and demographic collapse and disease, then certainly the importation of a new labor force. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? I think Doug put one in the chat, but I'll give anyone else any option. Okay. In that case, I'll read Doug's question, and this I guess will be our last one since we're coming up about an hour.
I have a quick comment, real quick.
Well, okay, Dr. Davis, you go.
Sorry, y'all. Dr. Perri, thank you so much for sharing about this historical account. My family personally is Ecuadorians. I visited Ecuador all the time, so there's a big Incan influence there. And I was recently in an Airbnb experience in Quito because I miss it so much. And one thing that I didn't realize is that there's still so much of Quechua influence in Ecuadorians' everyday talk, and I didn't know about it until I actually become aware of it through my virtual tour guide, that some of the words that my mom uses, like wawa or achachai to say it's cold or to call somebody a baby, are actually Quechua and not even Spanish.
Yeah.
So I think that's really cool that you were able to touch on everything that you did with the Mexican area and Aztec influence, but it's just something that touched home with me, that the indigenous influence is still present today.
It is, and it was very, you got some interesting things happening in Ecuador. It was one of the most recent areas conquered by by the Inca right before the conquest. And Huayna Capac, the Inca emperor, actually dies there from smallpox that reached the Inca Empire before the Spaniards reached it, just because it sometimes disease travels faster than humans do. And Goma Poma is why I got a book here of a Ecuadorian noble who would also, challenge the crown of how badly the Spaniards were treating them and stuff. But in terms of language, I just find language one of the most fascinating aspects of this. And you find in every region of Mexico different languages penetrating Spanish. So we're among the Tarascan people, where my in-laws are from. They have the word for children, for example, watches, right? And if Central Mexico, they're going to have the word for children is camachos, right? But obviously the proper Spanish word for children is niños. Where do these different words come from in these different areas of Mexico? They come from the indigenous languages that were prominent there before the conquest. And this is why you have so many dialects in so many parts of both the Andean part of the Americas and in Mexico, it's Mesoamerica as well. And it's absolutely fascinating.
Okay, last question comes from Dr. Julian, as filtered by my stentorian reading. To what degree is this commonly known narrative of disease relevant to our current belief in America of simply toughing out an illness and showing up to work and so on?
I don't know. But I'll give you something maybe optimistic to think about and maybe pessimistic to think about. COVID-19 is also a virgin soil virus or pathogen coming to us right now, right? The reason it's so virulent among our population is because we don't have any immunological defenses yet. Where it's a new virus to us, or for us, and so it is more devastating. The good news is that even if it's even much more devastating, the population will recover. In history, most of the times you have these kind of epidemics, the population does make a comeback. The reason it didn't in the 16th century, though, is because we have a series after series of new pathogens following in close sequence with one another, and the population's never given a chance to stand up on its feet and recover. I hope I made that clear in my talk. I might not have made it clear as I wanted to. The bad news is we are in a time when we are there's more people, and more people are coming into more contact with animals such as bats and other things. And like Europeans and their domesticated animals and close living with other vermins like rats and stuff, that there's still more opportunity for new viruses and new pathogens of all sorts to enter into our environment. So there's both good news and bad news. If this is the only virgin soil epidemic that we're going to experience in our lifetimes, then it's going to be probably pretty bad for a while, but then we will recover as a species, no big problem. But if this is just the beginning of a set of series of new pathogens infecting the human population going forward, we could be in trouble. And in terms of, I don't know, and I obviously think we should all wear masks and do everything we can because trying to develop herd immunity with this virus that we currently have might just be, it's going to be too painful for anybody to want, right, to go through that. So, but I'm not an expert in this. This might be a better question for David Allard than me.
Okay, that's probably a fair point, but also a good place for us to end it. So thank you very much, Michael, especially. Thank you, everybody who attended, who asked questions, and I'll go ahead and get this posted and try to put a link out on the History Facebook or History website for folks who want to watch it later. But thank you again, Dr. Perri, and take care.